Well, Buzzkillers, it's not often that we are able to interview someone who has made a major archival discovery, someone who's now written a book that's going to change the way we think about an important person from the past, but that's the case today. Today we are interviewing Jane Marguerite Tippett, whose new book, Once a King, The Lost Memoir of Edward VIII, is out now, and it is shall we say, lighting fires in a good way in British history circles, but also among people who are interested in the royal family. And of course, it's bringing up memories of Harry's memoir recently, and there are lots of parallels to that, which we'll talk about. But I'm talking too much. I want to introduce you to Jane. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me.
It's important to know, the Buzzkillers to know, that you're just not a history buff. You are an actual archivist.
I am an archivist. I hope I'm a historian now. Having read this book, I think in a way, though, to be an archivist, you have to be a historian. You have to love history, and you have to want to be preserving it. Of course, just not all archivists write a book.
Right.
So I've combined the two roles. I hopefully successfully now.
Oh, no, very successfully, very successfully. And not only by looking at the archival stuff that you found, but you actually did what all good historians do. You chased all the footnotes. You went to other archives to look at all the other material in order to get as broad and full a picture as you can. But first, let's tell our listeners, most of our listeners are American. They'll know vaguely, about Edward VIII and the abdication. They probably went to see the movie The King's Speech and stuff like that. But they don't know really a lot about him. So who was he?
Well, Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor, that was the title he assumed after he abdicated in December of 1936. He was the eldest son of George V and Queen Mary. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, so his grandfather was another unconventional king, Edward VII. His childhood, he was brought up at Sandringham in Norfolk in a relative anonymity, but he was catapulted onto the world stage in 1911 with his investiture as Prince of Wales. He served in the Great War. He did not serve in the trenches, but he was at the front line and certainly a witness to the full horrors of the 4 years of slaughter. He went on to then tour the empire between 1919 and 1925. This was really a project of Lloyd George's to secure loyalty in the empire in the guise of the Prince of Wales, who visited almost every outpost of the British Empire between these 6 years. He then went on to have a more stationary life in Britain in the late 1920s, 1930s. He moved into Port Belvedere. That was his home in Windsor Great Park, where the abdication drama took place. In 1936, in January, his father died at Sandringham, and he became king. It was the year of three kings, 1936, because you had George V, Edward VIII, and at the very end, George VI. He left England on December 12th, 1936 for exile and never returned to Britain to live. That was, I think, one of the great sadnesses of the remainder of his life, that he was an exile from his country. He lived predominantly in France and died in Paris in 1972. And his wife, Wallis Simpson, of course, who he abdicated the throne for, lived on until 1986 in the home that they had shared outside of Paris.
Yeah, we often forget that they lived so long because, of course, George VI dies in 1952. Is that right?
He died in 1952. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer. I believe he died. It was, in fact, a heart attack. Edward, the Duke of Windsor, died of throat cancer. All of the sons of George V tended to be smokers and paid the consequences. But the Duchess lived until 1986, so she was bedridden for really the last 6 to 7 years of her life.
Now, the abdication crisis is a big thing. And, of course, we all know that he wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American socialite. That caused problems in the government, but also in the aristocracy and social circles. People split over whether he should abdicate or not. In fact, this is one of Churchill's great, often cited lapses of judgment. He supported the king. He supported Edward VIII and wanted him to stay king. But why was it such a controversy? Why, especially Americans now, of course, we've dealt with divorce in the royal family because Charles is divorced. His wife is divorced. So why was this such a big deal when Edward VIII came to the throne?
Well, I think it was twofold. Of course, she was an American. That cast, I think, that certain. I think there were certain issues around that. More importantly, though, she was divorced, and as king, Edward was head of the Church of England, and divorce was not condoned in the Church of England. Now, there wasn't anything from a actual legal perspective that should have stopped their marriage, but it was seen as contradictory that the head of the Church of England should be married to a divorced woman. And one of the things I think is so always interesting about when people discuss the abdication, they call it a constitutional crisis. In fact, there never was a constitutional crisis. The constitutional crisis was avoided because Edward abdicated. Edward had asked the advice of his government for this marriage. The advice was the marriage was not possible. Had Edward persisted, tried to marry her, Baldwin would have resigned, a general election would have occurred on the question of the king's marriage, and there would have been a constitutional crisis because you would have had a direct conflict between monarch and government. And that never existed. The abdication prevents the constitutional crisis. So I always think that's a misnomer when people talk about this period. And one of the things I hope that my book stresses is that Edward felt the responsibility of being a constitutional monarch, and that very much informed his decision to abdicate because he felt he could not press the question of this personal wish in the face of a government that opposed it.
But now Edward comes down to us, generally speaking, the sort of standard interpretation, the standard view of looking at them is that he's very self-absorbed. He's only interested in what he wants. He exercises very poor judgment. You know, he should have, in quotation marks, just had an affair with Wallis Simpson and not gotten married to her, and all that sort of stuff. And that, especially in the 1930s, when there are very big things happening in Europe and the British are going to have to get involved, it's very selfish of him to think just about himself and just about his marital happiness. But your book, among others, recently shows that it's not that black and white. First of all, he's not stupid. Second of all, he has this one sort of selfish impulse, but the others don't seem to be that many others. I'm sorry, dear listeners, I'm going on here, and I should let Jane talk because it's her book and she's knows more than I do. But as you said, that trip around the empire was an incredible sacrifice, an incredible amount of work. That was years and years and years. Now, as you point out in the book, King Charles goes to India. He's there for 4 days and flies back. Well, in the olden days,
Yes.
you had to go by ship and everything took months.
It took months. Of course, communication was very strained. Edward spent a huge amount of time away from his family, but also away from traditional court circles. And I think in an age of globalization, we also forget how very different these experiences, these different encounters with cultures, societies would have changed him because we have access, I think, in a way that is unprecedented, of course. We feel as if there's a connectivity. Well, that was not the case in the 1920s. And Edward is encountering societies, different ways of living, cultures, and doing so over the course of, say, 6 to 7 years. And it changes him. He comes back to Britain. I mean, you could argue he comes back very modern. I mean, he writes in this memoir, he says, having been in the United States, having been in Australia, New Zealand, seen how people live differently, it was very difficult to go back to the top-hatted gentry of Ascot and the kind of closed court circles. I think it did change him. I think it widened his horizons. I think it made him aware of the different ways people lived and could live, different innovations, particularly with the United States. He was obsessed with what Britain could learn from the United States, which he saw as such a mobile, innovative society in all aspects. One thing I hope this memoir does in terms of counteracting these ideas of him as a self-absorbed and unintelligent individual is to show that he actually thought very critically about his role as Prince of Wales. He was invested in that role, invested in shaping that role according to what he thought would be the future. His goal was to modernize, to innovate that role so it would survive. Of course, this is a period in the British monarchy of extreme anxiety. They've seen the downfall of the great European dynasties. The Romanov family have been murdered. Germany has lost its Kaiser, and the British monarchy is trying to find a foothold in this post-World War I world. And Edward really becomes the standard bearer for that. He is out there. He becomes the face, the empathetic face of British monarchy. And I think one of the things I find frustrating when people talk about Edward, apart from it's always a black and white situation. And we know that's never the case in a human story. It's always nuanced. There's always variance of color. Is that, of course, there were elements of his character that were selfish and self-centered. He was, after all, the Prince of Wales. I think you, in a way, could forgive a man who was Prince of Wales for perhaps being slightly spoiled. But that doesn't mean that he's not invested as well in his role, but in making a difference. And I think one of the things you encounter in this material is that he's constantly frustrated. He says at one point, "I was a prince in search of importance." Importance for him was not having his face plastered everywhere. Importance was making a difference, particularly as Britain faces the economic crisis of the 1930s. And I think he was continually frustrated by his inability to actually affect a meaningful change. There's again, a wonderful encounter with Murphy, and he talks about going into working men's halls. And he says, the normal Prince of Wales speech wouldn't fly here. But all I really could say was, I understand, I see this, and I will tell the government. And that was, I think, very limiting and frustrating for a man who sought a greater impact in his world. He was at the fore of politics, yet had no power. And I think that was a struggle for him. And I think in a way it comes to a head in the abdication and in his experience of kingship.
Okay, now you just mentioned Murphy here, and Murphy was, of course, the journalist who wrote the story and then ghost wrote the book that started this project of yours. He's a journalist for Life magazine. Tell us a little bit about him, and then we've got to get to what I think is perhaps most exciting part of the story, because I'm a historian. Your story as an archivist, but first, tell us a little bit about Murphy.
Murphy was such an exceptional individual in so many ways. So he was a journalist for Time Inc. He began with Fortune in 1935, but prior to
Let's give him a first name, by the way.
Oh, Charles JV. His family call him CJVM.
Okay, Charles, right.
Charles, yes. Charles JV Murphy. Charles began Time Inc. in 1935, but prior to that, he had been the ghostwriter for Richard Byrd, who was a gentleman explorer who had done these extravagant missions to the Antarctic in the 30s. Murphy actually goes on one of them and writes his broadcast from Little America, which was the base that Byrd founded. And these broadcasts went out on CBS. And Murphy then ghost wrote his memoirs. He claimed after Byrd he was done with ghostwriting. Goes to work for Time Inc. He's writing for Life. He's writing for Fortune, for Time magazine as well. And he encounters the Duke of Windsor in 1945. He has just finished writing a profile of Winston Churchill for Life magazine, and the Duke is on his way back from the Bahamas, sees it twigs his interest, and they meet for lunch at the Waldorf Astoria. And it takes another year for them to meet again, but they have another lunch in November 1946, and they begin working together in the summer of 1947. And what I think is so interesting about the Duke's memoirs is we always think of them as it's the King's Story, which was the book that was published in 1951. But the muscle behind these memoirs, this is a Life magazine project. This was 3 articles that were published in 1947 about Edward's youth up to the Great First World War. And then the 4 further articles that were published in 1950, which deal with from the 1920s to the abdication. All of the prep, all of the angst, all of the research, all go into these articles. And it's really, the book is really an afterthought. It's just to pull it all together into some sort of permanent form. But it's the men of Life, Murphy, Henry Luce, the founder of Time Inc., and the sort of forgotten, but I think incredible figure of Daniel Longwell, who was the editor of Life magazine, who make this possible. And at the same time, who are also working with some people like Eisenhower and Churchill, who are writing their memoirs, who are also serializing them in Life magazine. So it really is a life story, I think.
Well, and I think what's so interesting, what would be so interesting to the non-historians out there, is that it's through the Murphy archive that you find this stuff. You didn't find it in the Royal Archives in Windsor or in another London archive or anything like that. Then this often is what happens for historians. We find stuff. I mean, use this phrase as kind of a crappy phrase, but through the back door.
Yeah, on the periphery. I mean, Murphy, he's certainly known in the biographies of the Windsors. I mean, let's pull away from the idea that he was the Duke's ghostwriter, because the Duke really wrote his memoirs. Murphy was an editorial assistant. He was a curator. Now, for Wallis, who he also ghost wrote the memoirs, he was definitely a ghost writer. Wallis was not a writer, and he wrote those. And though Murphy's acknowledged in their in each respective biographies, it remains as if almost this was a sort of flash in the pan, that these memoirs didn't really call upon the Windsors' time. They weren't really involved. They'd hired somebody, and they were just, maybe they looked over a few drafts. And what the discovery with Edward was that he was extremely invested in this memoir writing. Now, he wrote to his own pace, but he did so over the course of basically 4 years, from 1947 to 1951. And he labored over his manuscripts. He wrote everything out by hand, and it was then passed on to Murphy and via a secretary who typed it up. But I think because people have neglected to believe that the Windsors really worked on their memoirs themselves, they have then consigned Murphy to the periphery and to a sort of unimportant position in their lives. Hence, why nobody was interested in mining further his story or his archive.
Well, then what was in the archive? Because you talk, I mean, again, I hate doing, I always fall into this trap because I've read the book and because I liked it so much and because I especially like this part of the story. One might expect that Murphy's archive or the collection of Murphy papers or whatever however one wants to think of it, would just be sort of notes. Okay, interviewed the Duke today, interviewed so and so today, interviewed whatever today, interviewed the Prince of Wales today, interviewed. But there was a lot of actual meat in that archive that you were able to use. So give us this sort of Indiana Jones, I'm walking down to the stairs, the depths of the archive and all that kind of stuff. Don't make anything up, but tell us what it was really like.
Well, you asked sort of what was in the archive. I mean, I think the better thing to say is what wasn't in the archive.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, Murphy was clearly an assiduous record keeper. He kept everything. He not only kept the actual drafts that Edward had created, but he spent so much time with the Windsors that he was virtually living with them, particularly from about the summer of 1947 to the end of 1949. And he would have, he had dinner with them, they would have lunch together, and he would record things they said. He would date it. And so what you have is this kind of compendium of his experiences with the Windsors. He wrote letters constantly, reporting to his colleagues at Life, but also to his family about his experiences with the Windsors. He kept a diary throughout both of these periods when he was working with the Duke and then later with the Duchess. He also clearly understood, I think, what a unique opportunity this was. Though I don't think Edward's story was, Murphy was interested in political, economic affairs. In a way, the Windsors were a bit of an outlier in his career. He wasn't a sort of society writer. But he certainly saw in the story of this ex-king trying to find his way in the world something that was of relevance and piqued his interest. And the first day of going to the archive, I mean, I probably will never have another experience like this. I mean, I hope I do, but it was overwhelming just, it's almost that sort of when you just start, I've just got to skim through folder after folder, and, thick folders of transcripts of interviews with both the Duke and Duchess, which were conducted in 1954 when he was working on the Duchess's memoir. Vast typed copies of Edward's sort of early notes on his memoir. So when they first started out, Edward would basically give monologues to Murphy. Murphy would ask him questions, and then you just have a long monologue, and it's kind of disjointed, and sort of details are kind of sporadic. And these were typed up by a secretary. So you have those. And then you have these early, what I call essays, which interestingly enough, I thought had been written by Murphy. So these are essays titled, for example, India, about Edward's tour of India in 1921, speech making, lack of political comment, notes on the hypocritical attitude of the British toward divorce. You can only imagine what that says. The Duke of Connaught, who was his great uncle, Fort Belvedere. So I had assumed that these were actually Murphy's early attempts at ghostwriting. Later down the road, I realized these had in fact been Edward's, and Murphy had just held on to these typed copies and filed them. It was just, I almost, in looking at it, I remember thinking, I must have gotten this wrong. Someone else must have used this material. And I thankfully had sort of a few books with me just kind of as a cross reference. And I had Ziegler and I had Donaldson, none of this was in there. And it was almost unbelievable because it was so vast. I remember, I'll never forget looking at one of the sort of, Murphy would type up these notes of conversations, and he'd label them, say, chapter 10, or he'd label them anything that sort of tied into where it would be relevant to the book, or trips that was another theme. And it's a statement that the Duke made to him. And he says, I'd like to be remembered, not just having abdicated. And the impact of those words was incredible, because it felt, the connectivity with history was such a raw experience of reading this material. So it was an exceptional day, an exceptional afternoon.
Yeah, so you go there expecting to find Murphy stuff. Murphy knows this kind of stuff. But you actually find stuff from the Duke himself.
Absolutely.
And a lot of stuff from the Duke himself. It's not just scraps and little notes, let's meet for lunch. It's really substantial essays.
Substantial essays. You're looking at sometimes 40 to 50 pages of monologues. For example, they had a lot of collaborators. Part of the process was to get staff and friends of from the Duke's past to come and help the conversation, trigger his memory. So Walter Monckton was one, Jack Aird, his equerry, Godfrey Thomas, and typically these visitors would prompt lengthy monologues. So I think the one for Aird is, it runs to about 46 pages. And this is covering everything from trips to life in London, his duties in London. Aird was on several of the foreign tours. And at times, of course, the information can be repetitive, but it's vast. And I think it was so exceptional to find so much material directly from the Windsors. And then, of course, the interviews that Murphy conducted. So the Duchess, who did not write herself, the process for her memoir was that Murphy interviewed her and the Duke. And what's incredible is he kept a day-by-day diary at the same time. And he writes in his diary how the Duke has decided we should tape record our conversations. And, he talks of being at the mill at their home outside Paris and saying, the Duke had everything set up. I needed only the flick of the switch of the tape recorder to begin. And what's so great, I think, about this material, but also the book, is that not only do we have the Windsor's words, which are vast, discussing and confronting their most controversial elements of their lives. On the side, we have Murphy, who is narrating it, who is giving his own perceptions of these people, who is giving us this kind of bird's eye view of this couple who, I think, I can't imagine an individual would have had a more unique vantage point on the Windsors, because he wasn't just a friend. He wasn't just someone who saw them socially. He lived, he had this intimate knowledge of them. And I can't think of anyone else who they would have discussed their past with in such a direct way as they did with Murphy. So, one of the really great elements of this project has been getting to know Murphy's family. His daughter lives in New York. And I mean, one of the first, when I was sort of trying to get my head around this archive and what I was going to do with it, I was able to meet her and spend some time with her and her husband. And I really had these hopes. Well, perhaps had met the Duke. Perhaps she has some, she'll have a few bits of information, but she obviously was a little girl. And instead, what I find is this little girl has lengthy and intimate memories of the Windsors because she herself was living in a villa adjacent to their home at La Croix, going in and out of their house, playing. The Duke taught her archery. He gave her a puppy at one point. So she had these wonderful memories of them in a way that I can't imagine who else, well, living, and even very few others as a small child would have remembered the Windsors. And it's really added such a unique layering onto this project and onto, I think, getting a different perspective on the Windsors, one that's very different from what we've now been conditioned to expect.
Well, then let's get on to that different perspective. What do we learn about his life? We'll leave the Duchess stuff for Buzzkillers to read in the book,
Okay.
and there's a ton of stuff in the book to read. We're not going to have any spoilers here today. What do we learn about Edward that maybe we should have known already, but we don't know?
I think we learned that he was an intelligent individual. He was someone who certainly thought about his life, who critically, who thought about his role, who thought about the monarchy, who was in his own way extremely loyal to the monarchy and an upholder of the idea of the British monarchy, even though I think at times he doubted its relevance, perhaps. I think at various moments he doubted its relevance and particularly what relevance he could bring to it. I think we see him as someone who has been profoundly affected by the First World War. As I mentioned earlier, he did not fight in the trenches. He was not allowed, mostly for fear that he would have been kidnapped and taken prisoner rather than killed. He obviously had brothers, so succession was certainly firm. But these experiences of the First World War, I think, impacted his outlook and it never shifted. And I think when we try to grapple with his views in the 1930s, his alignment with the pro-appeasement politics of that era, I think we have to revert back to these experiences in the First World War, which this material goes into at length. He spent so this would have been written in 1947 as part of the first set of articles. And he's very direct in describing the conditions in the trenches, describing how the difference between officers and men, the injustice of that difference, which he sees at all points. And I think we take away from that time in his life that it forms this horror and distaste of military conflict. He finishes the war believing that there could be no diplomatic conflict that could warrant this kind of altercation. And he never wavers from that outlook. And it informs his views as we go into Germany in the 1930s, go about Germany into the 1930s, that we cannot inch toward the kind of crisis that went in 1914. And I think it's obviously, this is one of the most controversial elements of Edward's life, his views about Germany. And I think to properly situate them, we have to rethink his experiences in the First World War, which just in this sort of epoch of life, whereas a young man who was coming to adulthood. And this was his formative experience. It was shaped in France in the trenches, and it changes his outlook for the rest of his life.
Well, that's true. And so many people who have snap judgments about Edward and the Germany thing and the Hitler thing, and we'll get more into that in a minute, they don't know or they don't remember or they don't pay enough attention to the fact that he was a World War I veteran and not just a bystander. He was there, and that a whole lot of British politicians were there. And so a lot of the appeasers had, this was not a cowardly position to take. It was in many ways a very realistic
Of course.
position to take, and understandable position because they'd seen it.
They'd seen it, they'd lost friends, and it was such a fresh memory. I mean, it was 20 years ago. When we think now
Yeah.
when we remember back 20 years, that's recent history. That's not, that's not ancient history. And it certainly informed that how these men viewed the conflict on the continent, and particularly, I think, British men. And I believe there was a sense of the waste, that had been an unnecessary conflict, the First World War, and they brought to bear that view on the next conflict, that this was going to be yet another sort of a diplomatic blow up that resulted in the deaths and in the horrific conditions. Of course, it was a very different war, Second World War, but they anticipated the same horrors of the First World War, and that should be evaded at all costs. And of course, for Edward, his appeasement politics, which were shared by his brother George VI, that's something that we tend to also forget. George VI also believed that appeasement was the best line. In fact, he famously made a very political statement when he welcomed Chamberlain on the balcony of Buckingham Palace after the Munich Agreement. That was something he did not need to do, and it certainly showed his support for what had been achieved by his prime minister. I think Edward gets into trouble because he holds on to this view of appeasement quite late in the day, as late as the summer of 1940, when he has fled from France, he's sheltering in Lisbon, and he believes that there is at least the possibility that Britain needs to sign a separate peace with Germany, that the war should end. But of course, that in itself was not unique. There were many in Britain who, in the summer of 1940, having seen the fall of Europe, believed that Britain was next, and the best thing to do was to negotiate an amicable treaty with Germany. And of course, that has everything to do with a political outlook and nothing to do, in my view, with Edward's sympathies or alignment politically with National Socialism.
Yes, but there's the problem, and again, this is a problem of public perception. Public perception almost never is based on any depth of research or any depth of knowledge. It's based on shallow stuff. And in the public perception, in the public's mind, it seems to me, there are the two things. One, the appeasement thing, but also he met Hitler. He and the Duchess met Hitler. And those pictures, they're pretty damning. Of course, you could say the same thing about Chamberlain. He met Hitler. But those images are so burned into our historical consciousness that we almost can't forgive Edward or can't understand the complexities of Edward's thinking.
Yes, I find this again when we talk about a black and white reading of history, I find frustrating. First of all, Edward was not alone in having visited Hitler in Germany and gone back to Scotland. For example, Lloyd George had visited Hitler in September of 1936. Now, this was Britain's wartime prime minister, a person that Edward had.
We should remind Buzzkillers World War One time. He was the prime minister during World War One.
He and Edward remained in touch, and particularly in 1937. So if Edward would have, of course, known about Lloyd George's visit, if the former prime minister of Britain felt able to go and see Hitler in this way, first of all, I think that would be a reassuring precedent for Edward. In the summer of 1937, before he goes to Germany in October, he'd also met over lunch at the castle he was renting for his honeymoon with Sarah Leonberg. He'd met the IBM founder, Thomas Watson, who had himself also been to Germany, who had met with Hitler, who had received a very prestigious decoration from Hitler for his contribution to the German economy through IBM. And Watson, a friend of FDR, a important political but also business influence in the United States, has just done the same thing. And so there are precedents everywhere that would make Edward feel that this was not controversial ground. And of course, remember, in 1937, this is a very different moment than 1939. We have a different set of political circumstances. Germany is a country that enjoys full diplomatic relations with both Britain and the United States. We can't apply the knowledge we have about National Socialism now to the point in October 1937 when Edward decides to go. Now, I don't want to say that there weren't all sorts of warning signs that should have indicated that this was perhaps not a wise move. But this idea that somehow this one visit, this 2-hour meeting he had with Hitler, indicates his political sympathies and ideologies, in my opinion, is completely skewed and lacks an intelligent perspective. And of course, the other thing I'd like to remind listeners is, in fact, there should have been another photograph that would have been taken about 3 weeks later. And this time it would have been Edward in the United States visiting Franklin Roosevelt at the White House for tea again. And that, I think, should help reframe this visit. This was not a political visit. This was a visit that Edward thought was kickstarting his post-royal career as a kind of roving international ambassador who was focused on social housing and social welfare conditions. The trip to Germany was the first stop. His next plan was the United States, the two countries that were leading, of course, in innovations in the 1930s in terms of economic and social welfare. He wants to go visit. And through reasons that are too complicated to go into in this podcast, the trip to the United States doesn't happen. But I think it's so interesting to hypothesize, how would we view that visit to Berlin, or the visit to Hitler to Berlin, to Germany, if we had all of the imagery of this subsequent visit to the United States that should have happened, and these images of Edward with FDR. He was also planning to view one of Eleanor Roosevelt's housing projects in Greenbelt, Maryland. He would have been photographed with the First Lady. Again, this sort of counteracting visual imagery that I think might have changed and put into perspective what he was doing in Germany. And of course, it's disastrous for Edward's reputation in the long term that visit didn't happen, because we don't have that counterweight. We don't have that balance.
Right. Well, also, I think it's disastrous because people don't remember chronology, and people don't even know the chronology, and don't even know the chronology of when appeasement was still sort of understandable. For instance, Edward goes to see Hitler in 1937.
Yes.
Well through 1937, there are a lot of British appeasers working very hard to stop Hitler from getting worse. We did a show recently called Coffee with Hitler, in which a group of intellectuals are going over trying to civilize Hitler.
And Charles Spicer, I think, has done really great work on looking at this kind of diplomacy and the people who were trying to keep a conversation going to prevent another cataclysm.
Yes, and all this is pre-Kristallnacht. And the idea, I think, among people at the time, both and historians who actually know what they're talking about, is appeasement up until Kristallnacht is understandable. Maybe not a policy you would agree with or anything, but it's understandable why they're doing it. After Kristallnacht, appeasement is morally unacceptable. Well, this was a year before Kristallnacht, more or less.
Absolutely.
So I can't, but that's not what the picture of the public sees. They just see him with Hitler.
Sure.
They might think hell is during the war itself, for all they know.
Sure. And I think, what's happened is, of course, and we can talk about it if you want, there are other issues that Edward comes up against with Germany, and which are on very thin, I think, historically not terribly credible, these other allegations. But those allegations can always be paired with the imagery of this visit, which then creates a very damaging picture in total. And I think that's why this visit's so important, is because it muscles through the speculation around his other supposed statements, leanings. There's always these pictures to revert back to. And I do mention in the book how the Crown and Peter Morgan leans in on that in a big way when he looks at Edward in the episode in the second season. That's an extremely historically skewed recounting of Edward's dealings with Germany. But at the end of it, it's supported by historic iconography of these images of the trip, which also were very carefully chosen, not showing Edward doing what he really was doing throughout the trip, which was visiting model villages, visiting factories. He was doing things, not just hobnobbing with prominent Nazis.
Yeah, well, historians hate the Crown. We just hate it, British historians. It was the constant presence of Churchill is one problem, and the oversimplification of everything is a problem. But that's the lot we have to live with, the oversimplification in the public's mind. We can't expect the public to know as much as we do, to study as much as we do.
Absolutely. And one of the things that as a kind of game, as
Yeah.
sort of a rhetorical game I like to play, is when I've encountered people already, well, before this book has come out. Oh, Edward was a Nazi.
Mm.
And what I like to do now is to just say, well, why do you actually think he was a Nazi? Give me the rationale and give me the backup story as to why you've come to that conclusion. And I always enjoy hearing the answers, because it's extremely vague, extremely sort of patched together. Well, he visited Germany, and didn't he do something with Ribbentrop in the 1940? People don't really know why they think he is a Nazi sympathizer, why he's perhaps a collaborator. And I think that, first of all, that's a big problem. But it also leans back into, I think, the issue with the material that forms the basis for these allegations that he actually corroborated with the Nazis is in itself extremely murky, highly suspect. And that's a word that his official biographer, Philip Ziegler, used about it, and really is difficult to piece together. And if you actually look at the material, all it says is that in the summer of 1940, he still thought there should be a peace between Germany and Britain. That's it. And that has created this narrative. And again, with the imagery that's available, that I think has been spun. Again, Ziegler calls them his more venturesome biographers into this story that is, it makes headlines, it sounds sensational, but it's really not backed up by anything very credible.
Well, and at the very least, it's also a lot more complicated than this single sentence based on, frankly, a single picture.
Yes.
That Edward was a Nazi, or a crypto-Nazi, or a Nazi sympathizer.
And there are a handful of comments that he supposedly made in the 1930s that were reported by others, taken down in diaries. And, I've often thought, gosh, I'm glad my entire political ideology has not been sort of, tagged into one line that I said at a dinner party. I think we'd all be in a bit of trouble if that was the case. And then, going back to the basis of these allegations are his time in Lisbon in the summer of 1940, when he is there when he has escaped France. He's waiting to go to the Bahamas, and he is supposedly making these pro-peace statements to German agents, one of whom was his host in Lisbon, who had been chosen for him by the British ambassador, Sir Walford Selby. And these statements are then being reported back third hand to Ribbentrop, and these form the basis for allegations that he was a Nazi sympathizer. And I know when I was working through this material in this book, I felt as if I was kind of in a sort of in a trap, because it's so complicated. He's speaking to an agent who's then going back to someone else, who's going back to someone else, who's then telegraphing it to Ribbentrop. And what's, I think, even more fascinating is when this material started to come out, which was after the war. The archives of the German Foreign Ministry were captured by the Allies, and there was a process of publishing all of the records from the purely historical perspective of trying to understand German foreign policy in the lead up and during the Second World War. And these documents surface, and Churchill, his immediate reaction is, can't we burn them? Which is I think probably has not done the Duke much service, because the sort of radical, we must burn these documents, get rid of them, I think lends an air of suspicion about them, that Churchill felt they were too hot to handle. But other people, far less invested people, saw this material and totally dismissed it. For example, Eisenhower, and I was very lucky to be able to quote the letter in full, that Eisenhower is sort of amazed that this material is still floating around. He had seen it in 1945. And his ambassador, John Winnett, another respected, obviously very pro-British, he'd been one of the leading voices trying to get FDR to support Britain. Winnett found the material to be lacking in credibility. Murphy, again, I was so lucky with this material, because Murphy is always everywhere. And Murphy gets a hold of this material as well via Lord Beaverbrook. And he's commenting on it and basically dismisses the importance of it, as does his friend Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, who is sort of amazed that this is even being discussed. And there are other voices too in and around the Duke, Sam Hoare, Walford Selby, who speak publicly when this material is published. I think what it does is it gives us a sense of perspective on how Edward's contemporaries viewed it and him. And we see the real disconnect between how it was viewed contemporaneously when it appeared in the 1950s and how we view it now. And how it seems that with each decade, even though no new material has come out, it almost dominoes into even more sensational and more sensational and more sensational. And to the point that we now have historians, and I won't name names, who are hypothesizing that the Duke has given plans of Buckingham Palace over to the Germans to commit regicide, to kill George VI, and therefore he will be on the throne. And all of this stems from, again, one of these third-hand comments that's reported where the Duke is supposed to have said he believes that the continued bombing of London will force the British into suing for peace. Now, that's a view, that's a perspective. That is not suggesting that Germany bomb London. So, and I just think it's incredible the way it's just this material has snowballed into, as I say, with each decade, it becomes more sensational when in fact, nothing new has come out since the 1950s, and it was dismissed by the great and leading men of the day.
Yes, it is. It is absolutely astounding. And one of the more astounding things about this whole book is that you're able to show this sort of stuff in detail. But we have to leave it there in terms of spoilers because there's so much more in the book about lots of things about British history and international affairs that we've learned from your work that's so brand new. And so I'm so grateful you wrote the book.
Well, I just would like to say, I mean, what I've really tried to do with the book is to lean in on primary material. I've tried, I have views, I have opinions, but I hope that I presented the material in such a way that it forces the reader to come up with their own judgments. This book is ultimately a book of perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
It's perceptions, the Duke's perception about his life. It's Murphy's perception of the Duke. It's other contemporaries' perception of Edward. And then, of course, it's the reader's perception based on is a vast amount of primary material. And so I really ask the reader to judge for themselves and make their own conclusions about Edward, about Germany, and all sorts of other elements that I discuss in the piece.
Well, we can't stress enough that this book is so important that Buzzkillers need to get it right away to read it right away. Not just because the subject matter is interesting, but because it shows kind of what archives are like, kind of what archival material is like, and why that's so important to research in order to understand history. Watching movies, these things are tremendously damaging to historical accuracy. And what you do and what professional historians do is try to actually work with the real material.
I'd say as well, I think one of the reasons we talked a little bit earlier about why we think this archive has been overlooked. And I think one of the reasons is that historians on the Windsors have stopped asking the hard questions. They've accepted the stereotypes. They've decided this is the narrative. This is the way we're going to go. And so they've stopped being inquisitive. They've stopped looking outside the box. Because we've just accepted this line, and Murphy obviously in this material doesn't fall into these stereotypes, and therefore I think that's one of the reasons it's been overlooked.
Well, we're so grateful that you came on the show, and the book it's out now. It's doing very well. It's the press in Britain is all over it.
I was very lucky.
And we hope you'll come on the show again when you start your next project.
I would love it. It's been great to talk to you.
So please, Buzzkillers, you know what to do. Go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com, read the blog post on the episode, but of course, get the book. And we will talk to all of you next week.